Players gather to cast powerful spells, some of the oldest and most revered in the history of Magic the Gathering. Infernal Darkness, Withering Boon, Thoughtseize, and many others. Battling head-to-head in brutal combat, they all have one thing in common: to uphold their legacy and the search for eternal glory.
The Eternal Glory podcast is brought to you by the minds behind Bosch & Roll on YouTube, Arabian University, and theepicstorm.com. This episode is sponsored by Moxfield and financial advisor and certified financial planner Nicholas Robb.
Hello, and welcome to episode 169 of the Eternal Glory podcast, Lorwyn results and Macro-Archetype health. We've already recorded 30 minutes of introduction and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. As always, I'm Phil Gallagher, aka Thraben U.
I am Brian Coval, aka Bosch & Roll.
And I'm Bryant Cook of the Epic Storm.
We've already recorded 30 minutes of introductions and banter for the week, available in our supporter-exclusive pre-show. Check out patreon.com/eternalglory to gain access, or join as a YouTube member for the same content on YouTube instead. Shout out to our new members. Since the last episode, we've got CQ Eileen, Zeo Counter, Maestro Smith, Cuddles U, On the Rocks 84, Carlin Chu, Charles Plass. All of those people and all of our other paid members will learn about some major secret lair bullshit and a Wizards of the Coast lawsuit that we went in on in the pre-show. If you're interested in that sort of tea, you know where to go.
Life happens. You can't predict the unexpected, but you can prepare. Edward Jones, financial advisor and certified financial planner Nick Ropp can help you with your financial goals, planning with life's ups and downs in mind. Call 314-377-9524. Email nicholas.ropp@edwardjones.com. That's nicholas.raupp@edwardjones.com. Or visit www.edwardjones.com/nicholas-ropp to get started. Edward Jones, member, SIPC.
This podcast is now sponsored by Berserk Studios, an indie gaming company based in Quebec, Canada. If you're intrigued by the idea of a chaotic co-op musical bullet hell, just check out Just Shapes and Beats for a new spin on the shoot-'em-up genre. If a Castlevania-style adventure to defeat a source of corruption is more your jam, check out Infernax. Both are available on Steam, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation, and Xbox.
And if you're interested in advertising to 10,000 plus Eternal gamers every episode, reach out. We're always accepting new sponsors like Berserk Studios.
All right. So last episode, we did our sort of early look at what cards might be playable out of Lorwyn Eclipsed. And now we've got a couple of weeks worth of results, and we want to revisit a handful of cards from last episode to see how they are actually doing in things like tournament play. And we're going to start with Hexing Squelchure, which has put up results in Show and Tell, Storm decks of multiple different flavors, Red Stompy, Is It Tempo, Goblins, Energy, D&T, and Food Chain.
I've also seen it in Doomsday.
I haven't seen that one, but I am honestly not all that surprised. It really is good as a combo tool. I think it's, in fact, better in combo decks than it is in fair decks.
Yeah, and that's something that was really interesting when we brought it up, because Bryant and I were talking about it exclusively as a defense grid, and then you, Phil, were like, I'm excited to play this next to creatures, so it costs my opponent more life to kill them. And we were like, what? But I have actually seen that in action a few times, where the situation is such that, especially game one, the blue decks, before they board in their Wrath of the Skies and whatever, they're really counting on Force of Will to bridge the gap between like Oslet Pride and Barogoyf, or Oslet Pride and Ajani, or whatever. And if you play a Squelchure, now half my deck's off, but the Precious Plow in my hand, I want to point at the Oslet Pride, not at the Squelchure. And that's going to cost me 2 extra life, and the Squelchure is still in play. And it puts you in a really shitty position. So seeing this thing in fair decks, obviously the real cost of Squelchure in fair decks is what you're not playing in place, because you have to cut something like, I don't know, is it better than Voice of Victory at the end of the day? Or do you just play 6 or 8 Voice of Victory effects across the spread with this? But if you're doing that, then are you cutting 3 drops from your top end to get more of this effect? So that's where the real cost is. Clearly, this card impacts any game it arrives in.
In a fair capacity, I have found this to be a very high variance card where it is either absolutely crushing or close to irrelevant. In a fair mirror, the 2/2 body gets stalled super easily by just about anything. But when you are playing against a blue deck and you just shut off all of those counterspells at the same time, it can be crushing. And there's some very neat interactions that can happen where, like, there's a Chalice of the Void on 2, and it's like, okay, I will cast my Squelchure through this. Or there's a Chalice of the Void on 1, and you play a Squelchure, and then you unlock your Guide of Souls and your Ocelot Prides.
Yeah, I had an interesting situation. I played Food Chain Goblins with Squelchures, and the list that I got boards in Chalice of the Voids for certain matchups, and I had Chalice on 1, but I wanted to play Carpet of Flowers, or I think it was Carpet of Flowers, and I had Squelchure, so I could do that, but I didn't want to get blown out by a removal spell on my Squelchure in response to my own Chalice trigger, so I had to play out a second Squelchure to double shove through my own Chalice. And it was just cool that that sort of thing even exists. And the second Squelchure, especially in a deck with cards like Goblin Lackey that really wanted to get Swords to Plowshared, that thing costing 4 life is serious beats.
A funny story for Phil. I was on the play. My opponent had no goldfish results or anything. So I had a turn 1 Squelchure into turn 2 Lion's Eye Diamond Echo. And I was like, hell yeah. So I play out my turn 1 Squelchure. My opponent's on energy. They play like a turn 1 Ocelot Pride or whatever. And I'm like, okay, I guess I can afford to wait a turn. Maybe I'll just get like a deterministic Beseech the Mirror win. On their turn 2, they played their own Hexing Squelchure into the Spider-Man meme. I was just surprised to see Hexing Squelchure out of the main deck of energy, and I was like, well, that's kind of awesome. Phil will like that.
Yeah, I think the card is decisively fine in the Boros energy deck. Like Brian was saying a second ago, I think you end up with like 6 of the effects split between Hexing Squelchure and Voice of Victory. I felt a little like I wanted some extra flyers or sources of evasion or sources of burn when I did that, though, because when you're staring down something like a Barrogoyf, having a bunch of like 2/2 vanilla bodies in play doesn't feel great.
Another cool play that I've done is I was facing Moon Stompy earlier this week. On the play, they go Chalice 0, Chalice 1, go. And obviously that's some horse shit. But the game was dragged out because they didn't have a threat to follow it up. So eventually, I just went Beseech the Mirror for Hexing Squelchure. And everybody in the voice call was like, holy shit! Like, it was so awesome. I'm like, yeah, I've actually Beseeched for this card a couple times now. Like, this isn't like Defense Grid. I don't think I've ever in my life Beseeched the Mirror for Defense Grid. I've definitely Beseeched the Mirror for Hexing Squelchure multiple times now. It's very good.
Yeah, I was just thinking before you even said that a deck that can have 1 or 2 Squelchures and dig it up when it's appropriate, like a Goblins deck with Matron or like the Epic Storm who can Beseech for it, that seems like a sweet spot. Because the decks that would want to play 4 copies of this for the can't be countered effect don't want to have creatures in their deck at all, especially game 1. And that's kind of awkward deck building, but it does solve certain situations like that. And like Phil, you were saying, the decks that want a bunch of creatures don't necessarily want a grizzly bear. Like, that body is not impressive. So it has to add up to more than the sum of the parts for this card to clear the bar of playability, and it is doing that.
I've had a number of opponents in chat just be like, Hexing Squelchure is so annoying in the middle of sideboarding, because they're so used to not having to keep in creature removal versus the Epic Storm. And I've seen so many Swords to Plowshares and Fatal Pushes over the last few weeks of just like testing this card in post-board games, or my opponents will be like, so glad I ended this game with Swords to Plowshares in my hand. It's like, yeah, it creates an awkward tension. You can't just board in a bunch of interaction anymore. So just the fact that it exists is changing the dynamic of a lot of matchups.
Yeah, and that's frustrating, but it's not new. People just have to adjust how we've had to play against Doomsday and Oops All spells for years, and adjusted to the Storm decks now too, because Tamiyo's in all the blue combo decks, and then Oops has the creature pivot. We know how to do this, control gamers. Don't get tripped up.
This feels to me like the Xantid Swarm or Hope of Girapor of this era, adjusted for power creep.
I could see that. Rest in peace, Hope of Girapor.
So we'll see if you agree with me here. It is my evaluation that Hexing Squelchure is like very clearly a legacy playable card, but in my opinion, it is not the best card of the set for legacy purposes.
Right. You can kind of, if you think about legacy playable as a continuum, I have my collection sorted by eternal playables. Most things are just in long boxes alphabetized, but eternal playables are in binders, sorted by color. And my definition of eternal playable is if I have ever put it in a modern legacy or vintage deck, or if I've ever seen it in a modern legacy or vintage deck. There are some shocking things in that binder. If you were to flip through it, be like, man, when's the last time anyone played Rolling Earthquake? What are you doing here? It's like, well, it was in decks once. So there's like, depending on how we're calling legacy playable, Squelchure is definitely over the bar. It's not a pillar. I'm not sure if it's a staple, but it's definitely better than like a Rolling Earthquake, Subterranean Tremors kind of nonsense that you would find in my red playables binder. It's way above that, but is it going to be a staple 3 months from now, or is it just hot now and people are trying it? That's going to be the interesting thing to figure out.
I think that it's easily the second best card out of the set. I could be wrong. I think that there's a couple other pretty good ones in here. The next one could be the best card in the set. That said, I've seen other creatures printed like this one that never stuck around. So I'm a little bit hesitant, but it could be the best card in the set. If not, I think Hexing Squelchure is the best card in the set.
All right, I'll tee it up because I know Phil's excited to talk about Moon Shadow. This is the 1-mana 7/7 with Menace, enters with 6 counters. Whenever one or more permanent cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, remove a -1 counter from Moon Shadow. Go off, King.
So this has seen tournament finishes already in Dimir Tempo, Rakdos Aggro, Mono Black Aggro, Death Shadow, Bug Midrange, and Dead Guy Ale. I am so incredibly impressed by this as an early game threat, especially when you have it in multiples. It does not take very much work to grow this into something that outpaces your Delvers, your DRCs, your Nethergoyfs, and whatnot. And I have a couple of different screenshots of me just like goldfishing on turn 3 with a pair of Moon Shadows after doing something like a couple of fetch lands and a couple of baubles. I think this is so noticeably stronger than Stalactite Stalker, which was already a perfectly playable legacy card. There's some awkwardness here. If you are on the draw and you play this out on turn 1 without growing it, it will just die to a Bowmaster ping. But in the instances where that doesn't happen, the fact that it is big and has Menace as a 1-drop, and it keeps getting bigger as the game scales up, there's just so much to like here. And the card can enter your graveyard from anywhere. So your Surveil lands can grow this. So you can do fetch, Surveil, second permanent into graveyard from Surveil and grow it by 2. You can cycle things. Your opponent can counter your stuff and it grows. This is so much easier to get big than I expected. You don't need to get cute with this card.
Yeah, I'm really glad the first time I played with this card was on Magic Online, where my triggers were handled for me. Because you look at the card and you're like, yeah, Mishra's Bauble, Fetch Lands, Wasteland, I get it. I did have what you just described, Phil, where I had like turn 1 Moonshadow, turn 2 Dothy Voidwalker, and they dazed my Voidwalker, and then Moonshadow got bigger, and I was like, oh, damn. Yeah, permanent did just go to the graveyard, didn't it? Count it. And that was really cool. And as far as that Moonshadow dying to Bowmasters when you're on the draw business, you can just adjust to stuff like that tactically, too. If you see access to black mana, or if it's game 2 and you know what their deck is, you could just play your Moonshadow on turn 2 when you have a Fetchland or Wasteland ready, and you're covered. Like there's plenty you could do to adjust to something like that. And I've also been impressed by this card and how fast it heats up.
What I did not realize facing this for the first time is they went to go swing, and I was like, I guess I'll trade my Construct token here. Nope, it has Menace. All of those lines of text, and in my head, I blocked out Menace. So when you're facing this card, make sure to remember it does in fact have Menace. It does take 2 creatures to block it.
Yeah, it takes 2 creatures to block it, and shit can happen in the middle of combat that grows it. Like there's a lot of like Schrodinger's blocks where it's like this block looks safe, but that fetch land could represent a surveil land. Or my opponent could have something cute like Street Wraith that could happen mid-combat and completely blow me out.
Yep, or even just like flashing in a Bowmaster, pinging off one of the blockers, but if I fight over the Bowmaster, Moonshadow also gets bigger. These sort of conundrums. There's a lot going on with Moonshadow. I think that being the voice of reason in the room, obviously, I think if I have the choice between Moonshadow and Netherglyph turn 1 of a game, I would select Moonshadow. I've played enough of these sloppy back and forth black decks, whether blue-black or mono-black or whatever, where sometimes you get to that spot where they had the 4th Swords to Plowshares, or they just hit you with a sweeper on the turn you thought you had them, and then you need to rip one threat real quick. If that threat on turn 5, turn 6 is Moonshadow, that's so much worse than Netherglyph, and it's gonna, like, floor versus ceiling here. Is the nut draw of the deck involving Moonshadow, that's a higher nut draw than a deck with Netherglyph. But the aggregate or bad position draw, do we want to improve games we were losing or win harder in games we were winning? And Moonshadow will win games that Netherglyph wouldn't, which is a little different. So we are changing the ceiling, not just kind of over-nutting the nut draw. But Moonshadow does lower the floor compared to something sturdy like a Netherglyph or even a Dathi Voidwalker, much less Barrowglyph, things you can rely on for stats.
I really like this in the current metagame where we are expecting a decent amount of combo, and just flopping this on turn 1 and going, I don't necessarily need to play another threat for the rest of the game because this will get huge is so strong.
For sure. And you mentioned if you ever have 2 of them, like that, I had 2 of them in play a couple times. Holy guacamole. Those numbers, nobody can count that high.
So this is my personal pick for the best card for Legacy in this set. And, you know, metagames are going to fluctuate, but this is something that I expect aggro players to play in Legacy for quite some time.
I think that is a safe bet.
And especially if you're doing something a little weird, like trying to do Rakdos aggro or mono black aggro on a budget or something like that. Like this card is a godsend for those sorts of archetypes.
Yeah, is there any reserve list in a black aggro deck? I mean, you need like Wastelands. Those are your expensive cards. Then what? You just have a bunch of shitters? And I know Bowmaster isn't free. I think that card is, $20-$30, but you definitely don't need a dual land. I also had an interesting conversation adjacent to the Moonshadow deck where somebody asked in my comments why that Surveil land in particular. Does it matter if it's Undercity Sewers versus Overgrown Mortuary versus Shadowy Backstreet, whatever? And my knee-jerk was, no, as long as it's a swamp, it's fine. But then today, I was playing against Moonshadow, and my opponent got my Flooded Strand into the Void with Dathi Voidwalker in a spot where they were low on mana. And I was like, actually, it's probably right to play the blue Surveil land, because those are the fetch lands that you're going to hoover up most often, for the fringe case where that matters.
I also think giving off the false impression that you can be a blue-black deck yourself matters, because there's just so much blue-black nonsense in the format right now. Just having your flex slot fetch Surveil land be blue, I think is meaningful there.
Yeah, making the opponent think about days, even if it's just for a second. I don't think that ruse would last long against anyone who knows what's going on, but if it buys you one turn, that might be all you need.
I did run into somebody playing mono black aggro that was just sideboarding a couple copies of Flusterstorm off of those blue Surveil lands. I think they had like one untapped Underground Sea or something like that, but they were just running like 2 Flusters in mono black aggro.
Every day we get closer to God's Demir tempo.
All right, let me just take a moment to say that this podcast is sponsored by Moxfield.com. Just literally right now, I have a Moonshadow deck pulled up on my Moxfield that I pulled up as we were doing this conversation because I wanted to see what I was running in my mono black Moonshadow depths list that I recorded with. Moxfield is the best. Please use it. you will be doing yourself a favor.
Yep, and I ripped off a bunch of Legacy decks in a row, most of them featuring Lorwyn Eclipse cards, and they've all been on my Mox field since last week when I recorded them. You didn't have to wait for this podcast to hear about Hexing, Squelchure, Moonshadow, and Formidable Speaker, because they're all on my Mox field, I promise. And Vibrance coming soon.
Yeah, so let's get into that then. So last episode, we very briefly touched on 3 of the elemental incarnations. Vibrance, which is the red-green one, Deceit, the blue-black, and Wistfulness, the green-blue. So, of these, believe it or not, it is actually Wistfulness, the Simic one, that has the most results, but it's not very many. It only has 6 results to its name. As a reminder, Wistfulness is 3 Simic hybrid. If green is spent, you exile target artifact or enchantment, and if blue is spent, you draw 2 cards and then discard a card. And as it turns out, being an elemental that triggers up the beanstalk and or can be used to draw 2 cards and flip Tamiyo is enough to be borderline legacy playable.
Yeah, looking at Wistfulness, I'm thinking about my Eternal Weekend deck where I was putting a ton of work into Dimir Reanimator, and I don't think I would replace Tainted Indulgence or Roiling Dragonstorm, given the full context of that particular list with Wistfulness. Wistfulness being a Roiling Dragonstorm that you can reanimate versus being a Wistfulness that you could pick back up with Murktide Regent is actually interesting texture. But that deck definitely would not have any green mana in it to do the other thing.
I played a Dimir Reanimator League using Deceit, which, as a reminder, if you spend blue, you return up to 1 other target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. And if you play black, target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, and they discard that card. So the idea was that this can be a spell that bounces a ley line, or is a discard spell, or is a reanimate target. And what I found in practice is that at a cost of 2 mana to evoke, this was just getting caught in my hand all over the place. And it's such a far departure from Grief that it's not really playable in that regard. And even if you reanimate this on turn 1, the average legacy deck just easily beats a vanilla 5/5 on turn 1. It's just so easy to block twice with the Bowmasters to buy all of the time in the world. Dies to a Swords to Plowshares, dies to a Dismember. I think Deceit is full on unplayable in Legacy.
Yeah, that was my concern in our preview episode as well. These, the mana cost requirement on these makes them impossible to scam with. The bodies aren't big enough to reanimate. These are modest in the correct ways that I don't think they're going to shake up Legacy at all.
I have run into at least 2 individuals playing the Sultai Reanimator shell with these in them. And both lists were actually Up the Beanstalk hybrids. They were playing Up the Beanstalk in Reanimator because these spells do trigger Up the Beanstalk. And I had the thought, because obviously triggering Up the Beanstalk is very cool, but like Phil said, sometimes these just aren't good enough. Before the Up the Beanstalk shell list, there were builds with Worldly Tutor. Worldly Tutor is obviously nice with your Surveil lands because you can entomb something to the graveyard with the Surveil trigger on the stack. Well, if you're playing 1 Deceit or 1 Wistfulness, with the Worldly Tutors, you now have a little package that you can use to beat hate that's naturally built into your deck, whereas you draw these, they're not completely terrible, unlike a Foundation Breaker or whatever. I don't know what they were playing beforehand. That was just like a card off the top of my head. But they have a higher floor than some of the alternatives, is my point.
Right, and the Worldly Tutor builds are kind of cool because not only can they build your own Entomb pretty trivially with a Surveil land, but Worldly Tutor also gets Metamorphosis Fanatic. So Worldly Tutor is Entomb and Reanimate, depending on what you need in a situation. And with Deceit, it could also be Chain of Vapor or Duress. So, I mean, that's a lot of flexibility, but the cost is so clunky that we'll see if that's actually worth doing in Legacy. But one thing that did come up big at the Pro Tour last weekend, the Standard Pro Tour, people were scamming Deceit in a pretty serious way with the card Superior Spider-Man. That's a 4-mana clone that clones something in the graveyard when it enters. And 4 mana is conveniently enough that you can evoke Deceit on turn 2 to check their hand, and then cast Superior Spider-Man for blue, black. And because you did cast it, it coming in as a clone of Deceit still sees both modes, and you can do the thing. So there is some stuff in lower power formats you could do with these, but I don't think we're going to see that clearing the bar in Legacy.
And one thing we speculated is that like Vibrance could be good enough for lands. As a reminder, for red, it deals 3 damage to any target. And for green, you can search your library for a land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and you gain 2 life. This only put up a single 5-0 in lands, 1 result in over 2 weeks. That does not bode well for Vibrance being playable. And one thing I speculated is that the large number of colorless lands in the lands deck would mean that acquiring both red and green is actually surprisingly tough.
Yeah, you'd have to kind of register it as a shitty Sylvan Scrying that if they happen to have Magus of the Moon, it can kill that. But where are you getting all this red mana from in lands as it's currently constructed? And is that the best Sylvan Scrying we can play if that is what it's for?
It's not Legacy, but I did record Modern Living End with both Wistfulness and Deceit. And something I found with playing both of these Evoke Elementals was that my mana got tripped up a lot. There were some games where I would end up with one Watery Grave and the other being Breeding Pool. And I was like, oh, this doesn't really do what I need it to do here. Or I'd have like Overgrown Tomb and, a different one. And I just spent a lot of the league going like, oh, should I have fetched differently on turn 1 or something like that? Like wondering if I made a play mistake or if just the mana with multiple elementals was stretched too thin, which I think some of it was A and some of it was B. I didn't play perfectly, but also just the constraints of playing a bunch of these in your deck is real. So I would be careful about playing a deck that's just full of these because it is hard getting double pips for these abilities.
If Hexing Squelchure is Legacy playable and Moonshadow is actively good in Legacy, these Elemental Carnations probably fall into the category of people are going to try these and then we're only rarely going to see them in Legacy after these first couple of weeks.
I will admit, when I got my Lorwyn cards in, I put Vibrance, Deceit, and Wistfulness into the aforementioned Playables binder. I did not put Emptiness or Catharsis in them. They went into the box. And it's probably fair to put Vibrance in the box too, but I there's enough words in enough places that I could see these being part of a Worldly Tutor package or some dumb thing sometime.
Speaking of tutoring, Brian, I believe you are excited about this next card. Formidable Speaker.
Yeah, Formidable Speaker. We talked about this in the pre-show, of course. I was higher on it than you guys were, but I have played with this card a number of times, including in my adventures preparing for Spotlight, Lorwyn Eclipse, the sealed deck Grand Prix that's coming up this weekend. I've opened 4 of these on Magic Online, which is great because they're worth like 36 tickets each. And that has kept my drafting afloat. Aside from that, Formidable Speaker, this was quickly discovered and placed into a package that is near and dear to my heart, which is a Lorwyn. A Lorwyn makes all 3 drops free and have flash. And Formidable Speaker is a 3-drop, and so is Acererak, the Arclich. And then Acererak is infinite life drain with a Lorwyn. So this is a super tight Lorwyn package, but it's not better than the way a Lorwyn was already winning. Like, there's no tricks. There's no, like, Cavern Harpy stacks where your opponent can't break you up with a removal spell. This is worse at being a Lorwyn than a Lorwyn, like, dedicated Lorwyn strategies are. However, it goes into Omnishow, where historically my criticism of Omnishow is it's a better Magic deck than Sneak and Show. Just the cards, the quality, the way that you actually win when you do the thing, rather than usually win when you do the thing. All of the things. The interaction's better, getting to main deck Veil of Summer's fucked up. Omnishow is awesome, but it had half as many payoffs. The fail rate was higher than Sneak and Show because you didn't have Sneak Attack. You had to assemble Show and Tell plus Omniscience plus a 3rd piece in order to do the thing. A Lorwyn is your Sneak Attack. You now have the Show and Tell that you can send on turn 3 or even turn 1 or 2. The deck has Lotus Petals and Ancient Tubes. You can send the Show and Tell. If they don't counter it, you could put in a Lorwyn if they do counter it, you just cast a Lorwyn on the next turn. And Formidable Speaker can also tutor Atraxa if you're on some sort of just show and tell line, but you don't have the Lorwyn. And then Omniscience has all of the properties with a Sararak that a Lorwyn does. All you have to do is cast it for free. It doesn't matter how. So Omniscience is a Lorwyn with a Sararak. Formidable Speaker is a Sararak or Atraxa. And not to be dismissed, Formidable Speaker is a 2/4. And I played with this deck, and one of the rounds I played against a control deck who had enough to stop my combo, but I played Formidable Speaker, which tutored Speaker, which tutored Speaker, with tutored Speaker, and I just attacked them for 8 a bunch of times with my 4 speakers, and I won that game. Like, that's part of it too. The one tap, untap another target permanent, these are Ancient Tomb decks. Like, this is also a mana dork. You could also filter Ancient Tomb mana into Basic Forest to get double green for a Lorwyn. There's a lot going on here that really makes this Lorwyn Omni-Show hybrid pretty appealing.
I actually recorded this deck today, and I went in with very low expectations. I'll be honest, Brian is very high on the deck, or so it would seem. I am a little bit lower. I went in thinking that it was just a flavor of the month cool thing to record. I now think it has a little bit more legs than I expected. I faced 5 blue decks. I did pretty well throughout the league. I do think that it struggles against Days Wasteland. I think that's the one area where I feel like the deck could probably use a little bit more. I was playing 2 Carpet of Flowers. If I was to play the deck again, I'd probably just run 4. Because the deck is actually pretty good at grinding. And like Brian described, okay, they counter my show and tell. I'll just play a Lurn next turn. And I think the one thing that I really love compared to like other show and tell strategies is you can win very easily in response to Leyline Binding. Like, in order to do so in stock Omni show lists, you have to run a bad Cunning Wish package. You don't have to do that here. You just go, oh, nice Leyline Binding. I'll kill you in response. And you don't have to like fill up your sideboard with that 6 mana Stifle effect. I can't think of what it's called right now.
Sublime Epiphany.
Exactly. Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you always having my back. But the deck was solid and it had a lot of play to it. So I'd play it again because I think that A, it was fun, and B, it pleasantly surprised me and I want to see if it does it again.
So in terms of results here, just to put some numbers on this, there are only 4 total results right now with Formidable Speaker, split across Cradle Control, Painter, and Lorwyn. We might see a little bit more of this card in the coming weeks. Next up is Abundant Countryside. This is seeing play in Eldrazi exactly as we expected. I don't think there is anything else to say about that. But beyond that, all of the other more fringe cards that we talked about, I have not seen any results with any of the others. Have you all seen any other Lorwyn cards in action that are worth talking about here before we move on to the next segment?
I think these are the ones. I mean, there's a Merfolk that when it enters, you can untap all your Merfolk. So some people are trying some like Jeskai Splinter Twin Merfolk action. That's more modern. That's more in like the aspiring spike making content space than building new deck space. But I did play against Merfolk this week. So some people are moved by the new Merfolk and Goblins we have access to.
The problem with new Merfolk, though, is that you have to put Merfolk in your deck in the first place, which is obviously a trap.
Yes.
All right, let's take a quick break, and then we're going to do a legacy health check-in as far as pillars of the format are concerned. All right, welcome back. So to kick things off here, let's just define some basic terms for the conversation that is going to follow. And Brian, you wrote up these notes, so I'm going to tee you up here. Start us off with some definitions.
Okay, so, I mean, some of this might be obvious or remedial for longtime listeners, but if you're new to a conversation like this, all these words are important to know. In archetype, the word archetype just means what the deck does as defined by the commonly played cards that are in it. Like Delver, Beanstalk, Show and Tell, Doomsday, Death of Texas, these are archetypes. Macro-Archetypes are where you zoom out, where Dimir Tempo is a Delver. These are archetypes. They would zoom out to Tempo as a Macro-Archetype. And then we have, generally, I think, in Legacy, and you guys feel free to push back or debate this, because this is one of those things that people are going to argue about no matter what we say. I would say Legacy's important Macro-Archetypes are Tempo, Control, Combo, and Stompy. Do you guys have any rebuttal to that?
No, I would agree.
No, I'm with you there. Notably, there is not usually a full-on aggro category in Legacy due to the necessity of either fueling out aggressive plays via Ancient Tomb or having blue counter magic.
Right, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we get into this, because we do have one of our main resources, MTG Top 8. They actually do zoom all the way out to aggro. They only have 3 macro archetypes defined, which are aggro, control, and combo. And we'll talk about that, but where Delver and Dimir Tempo would be examples of Tempo as a macro archetype. We've got Eldrazi, Red Prison, and Affinity, which are all Stompy, because they're Ancient Tomb fueled things that try to go a little bigger, but they don't have Daze or Wasteland. However, it would be reasonable to call both of them aggro, though I think for a Legacy-specific conversation, defining Stompy and Tempo as different types of things is fair. But if we want to get super wordy or highfalutin about it, I don't know, like whatever it is, super theoretical about it, playing a bunch of 1-drops in your deck so you can dump them out faster is Tempo. Playing Ancient Tomb so you could play 2 and 3 drops faster could also be Tempo. These are the two ends of the same spectrum. And this is memed and debated. Like, what does Tempo even mean? It means time is the actual answer. But these are all aggro decks. But within, what you could expect to see in them, calling them Stompy and Tempo makes sense for a Legacy conversation. And then we've got archetypes like Doomsday Storm, Show and Tell, Oops. Those are all under the macro archetype of Combo, which are decks that intend to win the game all at once instead of making a plan over several turns to get small advantages. And then anything trying to play a long game, trading 1-for-1 resources until some engine kicks in and pulls ahead is going to be a control deck. And that would be, Beanstalk, various Quantum Riddler decks, Death and Taxes, Stoneblade, Grixis, anything like that. And like Phil was starting to say, Legacy in particular fudges these categories really hard because the card pool is so deep, the cards are so powerful. There's lots of examples of decks where they have aspects of both. Like Painter is a Stompy deck. It's an Ancient Tomb deck that's trying to jam out value permanents, but it also has a combo in it. Cradle Control and Lands are both control decks that have combo finishes, whether it's Natural Order or Merit Lage. And then there's mid-range decks, which are just going to cause trouble for any conversation, like Blue Stoneblade, where mid-range, by definition, is trying to play the middle zone, and they're trying to be aggro decks against control, and they're trying to be control decks against aggro. And generally, I would put those into control if I had to pick between control and aggro to define them.
And then beyond that, we also have pillars as a term for the core engine cards themselves that support multiple different decks. So these are going to be things like your Ancient Tombs, Brainstorm, Dazes, Wastelands, and Dark Rituals, just as some common examples. So when we are doing our pillar health check-in here, we are looking, how are the Ancient Tomb decks doing? How are the Brainstorm decks doing? How are the Wasteland decks doing? How are the Dark Ritual combo decks doing? This is the sort of thing that we're going to mine by looking at the data and the numbers.
All right, gentlemen, do we have any more terms to define before we move on to actually talking about the Legacy metagame?
Nah, I think the vocab list is done.
All right, let's take a break, and then we'll finish this out.
All right, welcome back. So, as we have already mentioned, MTG Top 8 categorizes decks by their big 3 macro archetypes. And according to their numbers right now, Legacy is currently 50% aggro, 27% combo, and 22% control. Notably here, their aggro category does include both Tempo and Stompy, and their aggro category also does include some things like Death and Taxes. So there's clearly some interpretation and discussion that can happen as to where some of these decks actually belong.
Right. They also have decks like Goblins defined as aggro, where Goblins is just a beautiful piece of machinery that can be aggro, combo, or control on different turns of the same game as needed. That deck just has so many tools, and like Lackey connecting and putting in Ringleader feels like aggro. Lackey connecting and putting in Muxus feels like combo. Grinding out like Munitions Expert into Matron into Ringleader, this feels like control. So, where do you even put a deck like Goblins? But MTG Top 8 does have a lot of things that I would not call cleanly aggro in this 50% aggro bucket of theirs.
And then we do have a secondary data pool from MTG Goldfish instead. So we are going to look at the top 20 decks in the format there as of the last 7 days before we're recording this podcast. And we are recording on Tuesday, February 3rd. As far as tempo stuff goes, the number 1 deck in the format is Dimir Tempo. Number 4 is It Tempo? And number 14, there is a Stoneblade deck featuring Daze and Wasteland that we're going to lump into this category as the things that are contributing to the Tempo Macro-Archetype.
And this is a trend that I've seen a lot around the Stoneblade shells. The Stoneblade is almost exclusively alongside Felia. Death and Taxes also plays Stoneforge Mystic, but the blue Stoneblade decks, they are also Felia decks. And almost all of the lists I've seen are playing 4 Wasteland and at least 3 Days, and some of them even have up to 6 Stifles, like 4 Stifle plus 2 Consign to Memory. There's some super low to the ground tempo trying blue-white Felia decks. I personally think those decks look awful, but that it does seem to be how people are building them more often than not. And I just played one of them today for the channel, and the first thing I did was cut a bunch of the Dazes and put real cards in, and it felt great. But right now, for the purposes of how people are actually playing this deck, it is a tempo deck.
Now, notably, there is an actual aggro list here, and that is the Ocelot Pride Energy deck, which kind of oscillates back and forth between being Mardu and Boros, depending on the given week. So this is a pure non-stompy, non-tempo aggro deck in Legacy.
Did you intentionally say the word oscillate and ocelot in the same sentence?
Let's say yes.
Do you know how to titillate an ocelot? You oscillate its tits a lot. All right, my co-hosts are now incoherent from the strength of my dad joke. Yeah, the Ocelot Pride deck is really unique in that it's not jumping ahead on mana in any capacity. It doesn't have counter spells. It does have Wasteland. It seems weird to call this tempo, but it's kind of just pure ass aggro. It is defined as mid-range on the various sites. It's called like Ocelot Pride mid-range, but calling this a mid-range deck seems completely false to me.
I would agree with that. It's definitely an aggro deck.
I understand why they do that, because there are these games where you like wiggle your butt in the chair, settle in, and slowly grind your opponent out by accumulating enough energy to attack in with a flyer through a board stall, or like wiggling to a spot where a cat token dies, so you get your Planeswalker, and then you start controlling the board with Ajani Zero abilities that ping creatures until you can attack in for lethal or send lethal to the face. There's a lot of games that get run over just by Ocelot Pride into Guide of Souls, GG. But there are games where you do settle in and just play like Amped Raptor value until I hit a Goblin Bombardment and send infinity damage at the face.
Right, and that's kind of that legacy category fudge that we talked about, because very few legacy decks can afford to be only one of these things in a format this powerful with Thoughtseize, Force of Will, main deck Consign to Memory, like all the shit we've got going around. The potential to lose on your own turn 0. There's such a range of things you have to be able to absorb as a legacy deck. And yeah, like I've seen Ocelot Pride decks that have Ancient Tomb and Barrogoyf in them. is that now a Stompy deck? Is that bigger commitment to mid-range? Are they an aggro deck game, one that boards into mid-range? Almost all Magic decks get slower after sideboard. I don't think there's a single deck, unless it's a transformative sideboard from something that's not combo into combo. Decks just don't get faster after sideboard. That's not how sideboarding works. So I think calling it mid-range in best 2 out of 3 is kind of fair. I would, for purposes of how quickly this puts you under the gun, this feels like an aggro deck.
I have seen builds that play the Borrowglyphs off of Ancient Tomb. I've also seen builds that play Clarion Conqueror off of Ancient Tomb, which has caught me off guard because I think that card out of these decks is traditionally a turn 3 play, and then I'm surprised that they have it turn 2. So I don't hate the Ancient Tomb there, but I also think that Energy or the Ocelot Pride mid-range deck, whatever you would like to call it, existing in Legacy is great. It's a great gateway for modern players to enter the format. However, something funny happened in our last episode, and you guys might not find it funny, but I do. We received a comment on Reddit complaining about how we don't like that Oops exists, or we think that it should be banned because they play a budget deck being Energy or Mardu midrange or whatever you like to call it. And they like that the fact that Oops exists as a combo deck that's budget. And they're like, well, if you ban Oops, you also have to ban Gaiasville, Echo Veons, Veil of Summer. And they just listed like 10 cards out of the Epic Storm. And then somebody responded to them being like, what's your problem? And they just started ranting about how they lose to the Epic Storm in leagues on turn 1. And I was rolling. I never commented, but I found it so funny. And I do face a lot of the Energy deck in leagues. It's a pretty popular deck, but you shouldn't be able to beat everything. And if you want to, Mind Trap exists.
Right, that's just a metagame conversation, which is kind of what we're trying to frame here, because I've played a bunch of Nethergoyf decks and Tamiyo decks over the last 6, 8, 10 months, whatever, and I hate Ocelot Pride. That thing kicks my ass every time I see it. And if I don't flip a quick Tamiyo, and if Tamiyo is able to stick through a flip to Johnny or some shit, or you don't have one of your 2 or 3 Caracases that you sickos are main decking, like, I can't do shit against that deck. And a deck that is that good against that sort of thing has to take L's somewhere else, because if your deck just beat everything, your deck would be banned. That's what a bannable deck is. It beats everything. You have to have good and bad matchups.
And having played a bunch of the Ocelot Pride decks, as soon as someone like comes to class with a Pyroclasm or a Wrath of the Skies or a Toxic Deluge, like they take your lunch money. It's over.
I think if Tamiyo does exit Legacy, which no one knows if it's going to happen, but if it does, these Ocelot Pride decks are going to be very good for the initial few weeks before people recognize that they need to play sweepers again.
Yeah, 100%. Like Tamiyo Plus really takes a lot of the wind out of your sails in the short term.
For sure. All right, moving on with our top 20 decks countdown. Number 3 is Eldrazi, number 13 is Red Stompy, and number 18 is Affinity, and those would all go into the Stompy bucket. Yeah, Eldrazi just sticking strong at the top of this metagame. It's not a deck I personally would consider because it's not my style. I don't really like doing that sort of thing, but it is a deck that every time I queue into, I'm like, oh, right, this shit. Damn, I'm probably going to lose. I feel like I see Eldrazi once every 2 or 3 leagues, which is a little bit more than its 5% meta share would suggest. I mean, or 6%. So maybe every 3 leagues is about right. But yeah, it's not a huge part of the metagame. It is certainly present, and it's certainly very good when I run into it. And that's how I feel about that one.
I think the real story here is not Eldrazi, but is the like fall from grace that the other aggressive Ancient Tomb decks have had. We've talked about this on previous recent podcast episodes, but Red Stompy went from being like a top 3 or top 5 deck in Legacy for a very long time to falling off the front page of Goldfish. And Affinity went from a top contender in Legacy to now something that rarely shows up in leagues. So if you want to be an Ancient Tomb gamer, you might actually be looking to combo right now rather than Stompy.
Right, yeah, show and tell is tough on most of these decks. I played today against Boros. It was actually Winota Initiative. Like clearly they were in their bag having some fun. I don't think anyone's deadass registering Winota as if it's going to be a great legacy card anymore. But I played against Winota Stompy, and at round one, or the game one, my opponent on the play just had resolved Seasoned Dungeoneer. And my hand was like Tameo, Felia, some lands and shit. And I was like, what am I going to do about this? And then I drew Swords to Plowshares, which bridged the gap to me resolving Felia, which flickered out their blocker. Then I took the initiative. And I was like, oh, I just pretty cleanly beat a turn one dungeon resolve Seasoned Dungeoneer as a fair deck on the draw. And it's kind of tough. Like these, even the air quotes, fair decks or control decks, Felia Riddler turns the corner so fast. And that's just an engine that's tough on these Ancient Tomb decks that aren't actually killing you dead.
I love me some initiative creatures, but you wouldn't catch me dead playing them right now. Like with Felia being so popular, Bowmasters being so popular, like there's just too many creatures from the blue decks that take the initiative back right now. It's so scary to cast an initiative creature.
It's worth noting at the end of the last trophy season, the trophy leader was playing Naya Initiative. And it's interesting. So if you looked at their results, they were doing both well in Legacy and whatever cube draft season it was. They were on the leaderboard for both. And I would notice that they wouldn't play Legacy for a few days and they would only grind cube. And then somebody would get close to them in trophies, and then they'd trophy twice and then go back to playing cube. And everyone was struggling to keep up with that Naya Initiative, but it seemed like this person just had the win button. They were like, oh, somebody's within 2 trophies. I'll trophy twice again and go back to playing cube. It was pretty impressive.
Yeah, get off my dick. I'm just trying to draft.
It turns out that if you're going to play initiative, having 12 copies of your initiative creatures is very important versus just having the 8 of like Caves of Chaos Adventurer and just Seasoned Dungeoneer.
Yeah, and I do wonder about, and this isn't to undermine results or anything, I don't know, but I do know that people who have been involved in trophy races a lot of the times drop when they take a loss. It's not like they play out the 4-1 league. Like they lose round 2 and they grind out the 4-1. It's like, no, I'm here for the trophy. You lose round 1, 2, or 3, you just muck the league, start again. And with a deck like Initiative, I don't know. And if anyone knows this person, feel free to correct anything. If they genuinely are playing out every league and just winning them all, that's awesome. But Initiative is a deck that plays quickly. You can scoop quickly when you're dead. And I could see, if you're willing to incinerate play points, getting 2 trophies pretty quickly with that deck.
All right, our next category is Control, where we are looking at lands at the number 5 deck, D&T number 9, Beanstalk at 11, and Esper Quantum Riddler at 19.
Phil, I thought you said these were control decks. There's 2 non-blue decks at the top.
Yeah, as it turns out, there are ways to play Control that are not just spell-based. And some people for years wanted D&T to be called something like Mono-White Control, because that is really what it is. Although these days it does very heavily tend to be an Orzhov deck.
Right. And it's really important to see how non-blue is the shape of Control right now. And Beanstalk, which is a card some people wanted to be banned 2 years ago, is deep in the whole of the metagame here. It's got like 2.4% meta share. Like the problem with this, and I know we talked about this for the last year, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, is the tempo decks and the combo decks that get to register Tameo will draw more cards more quickly than the Beanstalk decks. So why are you working this hard to be a dedicated deck around this engine when other archetypes can just jack your engine for free while doing what they're doing? And there's that hybrid Macro-Archetype access again in the legacy card pool.
And moving on to our final macro category, we have Combo. Number 6, Oops. Number 7, Doomsday. Number 8, TES. Number 10, Sneak and Show. Number 12, Cradle Control. Number 15, Painter. Number 16, Burn. Let's come back to that in a second. Number 17, Dredge. Number 20, Beseech Storm.
Yeah, I just want to shout out the Burn real quick, because we can't talk about Legacy as if that's normal. But, I mean, it's there on the homepage, and I'm pulling the data. Apparently, 2.2% of the Legacy metagame for the last 7 days is Burn. And looking at results, I see a bunch of 2-2s, 0-4s, 12th place finishes and challenges. I don't know, like it's certainly not winning, but apparently people are playing it this week. And if we want to filter by 14 days, it disappears. And then we get like Selesnya Depths joins the top 20. So maybe that's a little more normal thing to talk about. But, we try to let data drive the conversation where we can. And Burn is currently there.
I imagine this is people looking at Hexing Squelchure and go, what if in Burn though?
Right. Yeah. What if my opponent had to pay 2 life?
I am not willing to accept Cradle Control as a combo deck. I understand it plays natural order. I get it. I've died on turn 2. It has control in the name. It plays like a mid-range control deck most games. I really don't think it should be under combo, but I get it. I would personally put it under that control category personally if I was the one sorting this.
Yeah, I mean, we have Painter here as well. And at some point, you got to pick a lane. And when I was putting these into their buckets, I decided that any deck that contains Craterhoof Behemoth is a combo deck. And we specifically called out these 2 decks, Cradle Control and Painter, in the definition category. Like these ones are among the fudgiest. But if you cut the natural order from Cradle Control, it's just Maverick. And that's a completely different conversation. The natural order is a huge access point of that deck to winning certain matchups that it wins. And even though Painter and Grindstone are kind of secondary to the redundant engines, the various goblins and fables and sagas that Painter is doing, that is something like if Grindstone just was banned or didn't exist, we would be playing completely differently against Painter than we are with the presence of that card. And I think for those reasons, you just have to loop them into combo decks.
So in terms of overall categories here, just kind of bringing this all together, that puts us at 3 tempo decks totaling about 22% of the format, 9 combo decks at 27.4%, 4 control decks at 14.1%, 3 Stompy decks at 10.6%, and 1 aggro deck at 7.3%. I think the biggest thing of note here versus other legacy formats of the last couple of years is that we're not seeing something like 50% combo that we saw when Reanimator was the driving force behind Legacy. There is a much greater degree of balance here than we saw in most of 2025.
Right. Combo is still the most represented Macro-Archetype, but it's spread pretty evenly. There's a bunch of combo decks in that like 3.5 to 4.5% meta share zone. And I mean, if you filter back 30 days instead of 7, you get Oops All Spells. That's the second number 2 meta share at 7%, but it has chilled out, I guess, in the past week to 4.5%. But I think it is cool and good if combo is a large percent of the meta, even the largest percent of the meta, without being just one deck.
As the combo guy, I'll second that. I mean, it's also a number of decks. When we look at that combo presence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 decks listed for that 27%. When you compare that to the other decks, like Stompy, for example, it's 3. So it's not just 3 decks versus 3 decks, it's 9 versus 3. So I think it makes sense that some of these percentages are a little bit more lopsided than others.
Right. And Dimir Tempo, we have Tempo taking up 22% of the metagame, and 13.5 of that is Dimir. And that's the number 1 most played deck by double the second place deck. Like, that is telling a different story, even though, like, you could zoom all the way out and say there's more combo than tempo and legacy. If you zoom in a little bit, you see that there's a diverse spread of different types of combo and legacy. And there's really 1.5 tempo decks. There's Dimir Tempo at 13.5, and then Izzet Delver at 5.5, and then this Felia Stoneblade deck that I begrudgingly called Tempo because it has Days in Wasteland in it, rounding out that percentage. So there's really like 2 tempo decks in that 22% share. And that Stompy share is more than half Eldrazi. Like 10.6%. 6% of that is Eldrazi.
Phil, a quick note for you. If you filter Goldfish the last 14 days, as Brian mentioned, the Ocelot Pride mid-range deck is number 2, but I noticed that it has a blue pip in there. I was like, oh, that must be Mindbreak Trap. Oh no, it is not Mindbreak Trap. Some degenerate decided to run 2 copies of March of the Machines in the sideboard as a meme, and people that play Magic Online are just copy-paste machines. Guess what? There's more than one result with March of the Machines in the sideboard. This person just didn't want to register 2 Mindbreak Traps for something useful, and instead ran a meme and did well.
That's so funny. Yeah, and by the way, if you jump onto MTG Goldfish and you copy a list because you want to play Ocelot Pride tempo, and you just go to your LGS and buy 2 copies of March of the Machines without doing a single ounce of critical thinking, you suck. All right, guys. So let's just summarize this. Do we think Legacy looks healthy from this bird's eye view of just macro archetypes and the space they occupy?
When I compare this to what we looked at through most of 2025, this is unquestionably healthier.
Yeah, I think it looks great. And I think we talked about this in the previous episode. As a whole, I believe all 3 of us are enjoying Legacy, but we think it could be even better with some changes. It's not that the format is bad right now. Like, Legacy's pretty good. It's just we strive for greatness. We want Legacy to be better, and there's ways to do that.
Right. And those 3 tempo decks taking up 22% of the meta, where one of them, the go-to Tamiyo deck, is 13.5 of those 22%, where Control, it takes 4 decks to meet 14% of the meta. I think rebalancing tempo to be about something that isn't Tamiyo would open up Control's meta share, and then that would also help us move the combo numbers a little bit. Like, I think we're so close to an awesome format here, and I am happy logging in and playing Legacy. I am not miserable. I would like to see that one last little tweak, though.